At my husband's funeral, my daughter declared, "The mansion is mine," then froze when my lawyer spoke at my husband's funeral. My daughter boldly declared the mansion was hers. Now, child, you have to understand the weight of those words and the moment in which they were spoken. The day was already so heavy on my chest I could hardly breathe. I had just buried my George, the man who had been by my side for more than 50 years. My hands still trembled from placing the last white rose on his casket. My heart was tender, raw, and aching like a wound that had only just been cut. The church was quiet except for the sound of sniffles, shoes shuffling against the floor, and the soft hymns still echoing in people's minds. Black suits, veils, and sorrow painted every corner of that room. Friends and neighbors sat with heads bowed, some wiping their tears, some whispering their condolences, and there I was, sitting in the front pew, trying to gather what little strength I had left just to keep myself upright. That was the atmosphere, my dear, when Clara, my own daughter, my only girl, rose to her feet. She was tall and striking, just as she always had been, but that day she carried herself not with grief, but with something sharper, an air of claim, of possession, of triumph even. She cleared her throat, and in that single sound all the whispers hushed. I thought she might share a memory of her father, perhaps recall the bedtime stories he read to her, or the way he held her hand when she was small. I thought she might speak of his laughter, his kindness, or his wisdom. Oh, how mistaken I was! Instead, with her chin lifted high and her eyes sweeping across the gathered crowd, she declared, clear as day, strong as if she had been rehearsing it for weeks, "The mansion is mine now." The words struck like thunder in a chapel. I swear you could hear the gasps ripple through the mourners like waves crashing on rocks. Some clutched their pearls, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and a few shook their heads in disbelief. The air turned thick, heavy with shame and shock. I sat frozen, my hands gripping my black lace handkerchief so tightly the fabric nearly tore. My heart skipped, then pounded against my ribs, my ears rang, and for a moment I thought I hadn't heard her right. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, claiming her father's mansion in front of his coffin. Do you see, dear, the cruelty of it? I was still in the middle of mourning, still whispering prayers for his soul, and she turned that solemn moment into a stage for greed. She didn't even wait for the burial dust to settle before laying her claim like a hawk swooping down on prey. The mansion she spoke of so boldly wasn't just a house, not to me. It was the heart of our family. George and I built it together, brick by brick, dream by dream. Every hallway echoed with our laughter. Every wall carried our memories. The garden roses had been planted by my hands, the kitchen smelled of the pies I had baked for decades, and the study still held the worn chair where George read his evening papers. To me, that mansion was love in its purest, most enduring form. And to see my daughter reduce it to a prize, a possession, something to be claimed like loot, it cut deeper than any knife could, but she stood there unflinching as if she had every right. Her voice didn't waver, not one bit. It wasn't grief that fueled her words, it was entitlement. She wanted everyone to know, every neighbor and distant cousin present, that she was the rightful heir. She wanted to wear that house like a crown on her head. My body sat still, but inside, storms raged. A mother's heart is strange, you know. Even in the sting of betrayal, I wanted to shield her, to protect her from her own foolishness. I wanted to rise and hush her, to whisper, "Not now, my child, not here," but I couldn't. My voice wouldn't come, the weight of her words pressed too heavy on my chest. I looked around the room then, some eyes turned toward me, searching for my reaction, wondering if I'd stand up and strike her down with words of my own. Others looked away, embarrassed on her behalf, ashamed that such a declaration had stolen the sanctity of that moment. I'll never forget the way George's oldest friend, old Mr. Wallace, lowered his head and shook it slowly, as though mourning not just my husband, but also the daughter who had forgotten herself, and in that instant something inside me shifted. Grief gave way to a quiet strength. I did not rise, nor did I speak. I let her words hang there in the silence they deserved. I knew the time would come when truth would rise and put her back in her place, but that moment, oh, that was hers, and it showed the world not her strength, but her weakness. So yes, at my husband's funeral, my daughter boldly declared the mansion was hers. And though her words stung me sharper than any thorn, I sat in silence, knowing deep in my bones that a greedy tongue will always reveal itself. Sometimes, my dear, betrayal doesn't come from enemies at your doorstep, but from the very child you once rocked to sleep in your arms. The guests gasped, shocked at her greed in such a sacred moment. Ah, child, let me paint that picture for you. The church was heavy with grief, the air thick with the scent of lilies and polished wood. The candles flickered, their flames swaying gently as though even they mourned the passing of my George. People had come with heavy hearts, dressed in black, to honor a man who had touched so many lives with kindness, laughter, and a steady hand of wisdom. When Clara's voice cut through the silence, "The mansion is mine now," the whole room seemed to stop breathing. For a few seconds time itself froze, then came the sound, a sharp collective gasp. It was as if the very walls of the church sucked in the air in disbelief. I saw Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor of 30 years, clutch her chest with her lace, gloved hand, her eyes widening so far I feared they might spill from her face. She had come to comfort me, to offer her support, but now her gaze darted between me and Clara like she had stumbled into a scandal she never expected. Mr. Wallace, George's closest friend, lowered his head with a slow shake, his jaw tightening. His cane tapped against the wooden floor as though his body needed some outlet for the frustration he dared not voice aloud. He had known Clara since she was a little girl, since she sat on her daddy's lap and called him Uncle Wallace. To hear such words from her must have pierced him too, like a betrayal of the memory of the man lying in his coffin. Even the younger folk, who sometimes don't notice the weight of propriety, gasped. I saw one of the grandchildren's friends nudge another, their wide eyes full of surprise. The sound of whispers began to rise, quiet at first, then swelling like wind rustling through dry leaves. People leaned into one another, murmuring things like, "Did she really say that?" And at her father's funeral. Their heads turned, their brows furrowed, and their lips twisted into lines of disapproval. In that sacred place, where sorrow should have united us all, Clara's words had shattered the solemnity like glass on a stone floor. Child, funerals are not just gatherings. They are sacred pauses in time. They are moments when hearts, no matter how divided, soften and come together to honor the one who has passed. In that moment, everyone had come with one purpose, to lay George to rest with dignity and love. No one expected greed to raise its head, bold and brazen, in the very shadow of his coffin. That's why the gasps cut so deep. They weren't just reacting to her claim of the mansion. They were recoiling at the disrespect to her father's memory. I remember catching sight of the pastor's face. His lips pressed tight, his brows knit close. He did not speak, but his silence was thunderous. A man of God, used to words, chose instead to let his expression tell the story of his dismay. His eyes said it all. "Child, this is neither the place nor the time." One of the older women in the back pew even shook her head and muttered under her breath, "Lord, have mercy." And mercy was what I prayed for too in that instant. Not for myself, but for my daughter, who did not see how far she had strayed from the path of love and respect. Now I want you to understand something, dear. The gasp of the guests was not just shock. It was also shame. It was the shame of watching a daughter dishonor her father on the very day he was being laid to rest. It was the shame of seeing greed outweigh grief. People are quick to forgive mistakes made in sorrow, but greed in a sacred moment, sticks like tar to one's reputation. The sound of that gasp still lingers in my memory. It wasn't a single noise, but a chorus, men, women, young and old, all drawn into the same stunned breath. It was the sound of respect colliding with disbelief. It was the sound of hearts breaking a little, not for me only, but for the daughter they once thought better of. And while the gasps faded into whispers, I sat still, my hands folded on my lap, my back straight as a board. My heart was trembling, but my face was calm. I let the murmurs swirl around me, let the shame belong to her and not to me. I would not let her drag me into her storm. I saw Clara standing there, her eyes darting across the crowd as the reality of their reaction sank in. For a moment, I believe she thought they would cheer her, that they would nod in agreement, that they would see her as the rightful heiress. But instead, all she saw in their faces was horror, disappointment, and judgment. That gasp was the sound of a mirror-shattering child. Clara's image of herself as strong, rightful, deserving, cracked and splintered under the weight of their disbelief. She thought she was staking a claim, but what she really did was expose the nakedness of her greed. So yes, the guests gasped, shocked at her greed in such a sacred moment. And that gasp told me more than any words could. It told me I wasn't alone in my hurt, that others too saw the wrong in what she had done. It told me that while grief filled the room, dignity still lived in the hearts of those present. It reminded me that no matter how loudly greed speaks, truth and respect will always echo louder. I stayed quiet, though my heart ached at her betrayal. Now, child, silence can be a strange thing. Sometimes it is born from wisdom, and sometimes it is born from wounds so deep that words cannot escape. That day at George's funeral, when my daughter's voice rose above the weeping and declared her claim to the mansion, I felt both those silences pressing upon me. My lips wanted to move, oh yes, they did. The mother in me wanted to cry out, "Clara, stop. This is your father's funeral, have some respect." The woman in me wanted to say, "That house is mine, built with my hands as much as his, and you will not strip me of it." But grief held me like chains, and the ache in my chest felt too heavy for words. So I sat still. My fingers clutched the black lace handkerchief in my lap, twisting and wringing it as though I could squeeze the hurt out of my body. I could feel the sting behind my eyes, that sharp heat of tears threatening to fall, but I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I had buried my husband that morning. I would not bury my dignity too. Inside, though, my heart was bleeding. Do you know what betrayal feels like, child? It isn't always the loud slamming of doors or the sharp cut of words. Sometimes it is quiet, subtle, but it carves deeper than anything else. It is when someone you held in your arms as a baby, someone you nursed when they were sick, someone whose tears you once wiped away with your own sleeve, stands before you and shows you that your love was not enough to tame their greed. That was the ache I carried in that silence, the ache of realizing my daughter had chosen possessions over respect, inheritance over honor, greed over grief. I looked at her standing tall, chin lifted like a queen claiming her throne, and all I could see was the little girl she once was. The girl who used to run barefoot through the hallways of that mansion, giggling with her father as he chased her, the girl who used to fall asleep curled against me when thunderstorms rattled the windows. The girl who once promised me, with all the sincerity only a child can have, "Mama, I'll always take care of you." Where had that girl gone? What had life done to her heart? Or perhaps what had I failed to teach her? Those questions pierced me even deeper than her words, but I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew words in that moment would be wasted. My grief was too raw, her greed too loud, and the room too heavy with shock. Silence was my shield, my way of saying, "I will not stoop to this ugliness, not here, not today." It is a lesson I learned over many years, child, that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is say nothing. My silence told her, and everyone watching, more than a scolding ever could. It told them I would not fight over a man's coffin. It told them I still honored George with dignity, even if his daughter did not. And it told Clara that her betrayal hurt me more than anger ever could. Oh, but make no mistake, the hurt was there. My heart ached so fiercely I thought it might split in two. Betrayal from a stranger is one thing. You can brush it off, turn your back, and walk away. But betrayal from your own blood, your own child, that is a wound that does not close easily. It echoes, it lingers, it whispers to you in the night when you lie awake staring at the ceiling, asking yourself, where did I go wrong? I wanted to scream, to cry, to collapse under the weight of it all. But instead, I sat tall in that pew, my back straight, my hands folded. my face calm as still water. Because I knew if I let myself break in front of them, in front of her, then her greed would have stolen more than just respect. It would have stolen my strength too. So I stayed quiet. I let the whispers of the guests rise and fall around me. I let Clara's words linger in the air like smoke from a fire she herself had lit, and I let my silence be the answer. Later, when I was alone in my room, when the candles had burned low and the house was quiet, that's when the tears came. I wept not just for my husband, but for the daughter I felt I had lost. I pressed my hands to my chest and whispered to George, "She doesn't see what she's done to me, but you, my love, you know, you always knew." That night I realized something important, child. Silence is not weakness, it is strength. It is a way of saying, you cannot drag me into the mud with you. And though my heart ached at her betrayal, I carried that silence like armor. Yes, I stayed quiet that day, though my heart bled inside. And in that quiet, I found my dignity, my strength, and the calm certainty that truth would soon come to light. My lawyer stepped forward with my husband's will in hand. Now, child, let me tell you, that moment felt like the earth itself shifted beneath our feet. There we were in that church, heavy with grief, my daughter's words still hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that had no business burning. The guests were unsettled, whispers rippling through the pews, shock painted on every face. And then, like a steady hand cutting through a storm, Mr. Jennings, our family lawyer, rose from his seat. He was a tall man, lean with age, but with a spine straight as the truth itself. His gray suit was neat, his shoes polished, and his spectacles caught the light from the stained glass windows. He moved without haste, without anger, but with a purpose so firm it hushed the room. Even the whispers fell quiet as his footsteps echoed against the church floor. In his hand he carried a leather folder, worn but sturdy, the kind of folder that had guarded secrets and promises for decades. And inside it, I knew, rested the words of my George, written not just on paper, but in love, loyalty, and foresight. I had sat with George many evenings as he worked on that will. He was a practical man, my husband. He believed in leaving things clear, in sparing his family any quarrels after his time was done. Maggie, he'd say, looking at me over his glasses, I want to make sure you'll be taken care of. You've stood by me through everything, and I'll not have anyone trying to rob you of what we built together. At the time, I thought his caution was unnecessary. I trusted in the bonds of family, but oh, how right he was to prepare. So when I saw Mr. Jennings step forward, that folder in his hand, my heart found a little piece of comfort. Not joy, no. There was no joy in that moment, but a kind of reassurance, like seeing a lighthouse beam through thick fog. He cleared his throat gently, not loud or showy, but enough to command attention. All eyes turned to him, even Clara's. She stood frozen, her declaration still fresh in everyone's ears, but her confidence began to waver the moment she saw that folder. Her chin didn't lift quite as high, and I caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jennings began, his voice firm and even. I had not intended to speak today, for this occasion is meant to honor the life of Mr. George Thompson. But given the circumstances and certain claims that have been made, I find it necessary to bring clarity." He laid the folder gently on the small lectern at the front, his hands precise, deliberate. The sound of the clasp opening seemed louder than thunder in that hushed room. Paper rustled, and with it came the weight of truth. Clara shifted where she stood. She hadn't expected this, not today, not so soon. She likely thought she could plant her flag in front of everyone, claim her prize, and let the matter rest in her favor. But George had been wiser than that. He had left his wishes written, sealed, and entrusted to this man who now stood like justice itself, Mr. George Thompson. Jennings continued, adjusting his spectacles, left behind a clear and legally binding will. In it, he detailed precisely the distribution of his estate, including the mansion in question. The guests leaned forward, their breath held. Some looked at Clara, some at me, but all waited to hear what George had decreed. I sat still, my hands folded, my heart pounding, yet I felt George's presence beside me. It was almost as if he whispered in my ear, "Don't worry, Maggie, I've taken care of you." Jennings lifted a page and read, his voice steady as a church bell. It is my express wish. The will said that my wife, Margaret, retain full ownership and control of our home, the Thompson mansion, for as long as she lives. She has been my partner, my strength, and my anchor, and it is her right to continue living in the house we built together. There it was, clear as daylight. The truth spoken not by me, not by argument or defense, but by George himself. His words reached beyond the grave, firm and final. Clara's face paled, her lips parted, but no sound came out. The strength she had shown moments before drained from her like water from a cracked jug. The guests who had gasped in shock earlier now sat with eyes wide, their disapproval shifting into something else, judgment perhaps or pity, but most of all understanding. Jennings didn't stop there. He closed the will gently, folded his hands on top of it, and looked directly at Clara. His voice softened, but it carried the weight of finality. This was your father's wish, Miss Thompson, and in matters of both law and love, his word stands. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of truth settling into the bones of the room. People nodded quietly, some with relief, some with sorrow for the daughter who had let greed stain her grief. As for me, I sat in that pew with my heart both aching and eased. Aching because my daughter had shown me a side of herself I wished I had never seen. Eased because George's foresight had spared me the battle. He had spoken for me when I could not find the strength to speak for myself. So yes, my lawyer stepped forward with my husband's will in hand, and in that simple act he restored dignity to the moment. He reminded everyone present that love, foresight, and justice still had the final say, even over greed, even in grief. He announced the mansion was left entirely to me, not my daughter. Ah, child, when those words fell from Mr. Jennings's lips, the air in the church shifted like a storm breaking open the sky. There had been tension in the room, thick, heavy tension after Clara's bold claim. But now, with those simple words, it was as though truth itself had walked in and taken a seat among us. The mansion, Mr. Jennings said, his voice calm but strong enough to carry to the back pews, is left in full and absolute ownership to Mrs. Margaret Thompson. It was Mr. George Thompson's wish that his wife retain their home for the rest of her natural life, and that no other party has a claim to it without her consent. The room went so quiet you could hear the creak of the old pews as people leaned forward. Even the flickering of the candles seemed louder than the breath of the mourners. Every ear strained, every eye widened. And then, like water finding its path, whispers began to flow, oft astonished murmurs traveling from one end of the church to the other. For me, those words struck deeper than anyone else could have known. My heart swelled with sorrow and love all at once. I could hear George's voice in every line of that will. My George, always steady, always thinking ahead, had made sure I would be safe, even in his absence. He knew me, he knew the life we had built, the sacrifices I had made, the countless years I had poured into turning that house into a home, and he honored it, he honored me, but for Clara, oh, those words were a hammer to glass. I watched her face, and I'll never forget it. Her chin, which had been lifted so proudly when she declared her false claim, faltered. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted as if searching for a way out of the trap she had walked herself into. Color drained from her cheeks until she looked almost ghostly under the dim church lights. She opened her mouth as though to protest, but no sound came. Pride can puff a person up, but truth has a way of pricking that balloon so quickly, there's nothing left but silence. The guests turned to me then, and I could feel their gazes heavy upon my shoulders. Some nodded in approval, their eyes softening with respect. Others shook their heads faintly, perhaps pitying Clara for her public humiliation, though she had brought it upon herself. A few looked as though they wanted to clap their hands together and say, "There it is, justice." And me, I sat still, hands folded neatly in my lap, my back straight though my heart was trembling. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, I didn't even glance at my daughter. Dignity, child, is sometimes all a woman has to hold onto, and I wasn't about to let mine slip away. Inside, though, a storm brewed. Do you know how strange it feels to be vindicated and wounded all at once? My husband had stood by me even beyond the grave, and for that I felt an ache of gratitude so deep I could have wept. But at the same time, the truth of Clara's betrayal, pressed like a stone on my chest. That George had to protect me from our own child. Well, that realization burned like fire, but still Mr. Jennings's words wrapped around me like a shield. He went on, speaking with precision, reading line by line from that will, making it abundantly clear. The mansion belonged to me alone. No contest, no loophole, no room for argument. I noticed Clara shrinking in her place. The boldness she had carried when she stood and claimed the mansion had melted into nothing but shame. Her eyes flickered from the lawyer to the crowd to me, then down at her hands. She looked small, like a child caught stealing cookies from a jar. Only this time the theft she attempted was no small thing. It was her father's legacy, her mother's home, the very heart of our family. When Jennings closed the folder with a soft click, it sounded to me like the final note of a hymn. Solemn, final, and clear. He adjusted his glasses, gave a small nod in my direction, and stepped back. His duty was done, and he had done it well. For a few moments after, the church remained hushed. Then I heard someone murmur softly, "Good, that's the way it should be." Another voice added, George knew what he was doing. And those words, my dear, meant more to me than I can say. Because they reminded me that though Clara had shamed herself, my George's memory remained untarnished in the eyes of those who loved and respected him. As for me, I drew a slow, steady breath and held my head high. I didn't need to say anything. My silence carried all the answers. George's will had spoken for me. Jennings had read it aloud for all to hear, and the truth was laid bare like scripture on the pulpit. So yes, he announced the mansion was left entirely to me, not my daughter, and in that moment justice did not come with thunder or lightning. It came with calm certainty, with dignity restored, and with a quiet victory for love over greed. But let me tell you something, child, even when justice is on your side, betrayal still leaves a scar. I walked out of that church with the weight of both. My home was safe, but my heart ached for the daughter who had forgotten her place, her respect, and her love. My daughter froze, her pride collapsing as whispers filled the room. Ah, child, I will never forget the look on Clara's face that day. It was as if the very ground had opened beneath her feet, and she no longer knew where to stand. Just moments earlier, she had stood so tall, so certain of herself, her chin lifted, her voice strong as she declared her claim. Pride, my dear, can be a heavy cloak. It gives the illusion of power, but it can unravel in a heartbeat when truth comes knocking. When Mr. Jennings read out George's will, those firm, deliberate words that placed the mansion in my hands, Clara's boldness shattered. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She stood there like a statue carved from stone, only her eyes betraying the storm within. I saw her pride falter little by little as the whispers began to spread through the church like ripples across a still pond. "Did you hear that?" One voice murmured, "It belongs to Margaret, not Clara." Another whispered. The words were soft, but in the hush of that sacred place, every syllable seemed to echo, and each whisper, each sideways glance, was like a pebble striking the brittle glass of her pride. Her hands, which had been folded confidently in front of her, began to twitch, her fingers tugging at the hem of her dress. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Her eyes darted from face to face, looking for an ally, someone to defend her, someone to nod in agreement with her claim. But all she saw were frowns, widened eyes, and heads shaking slowly in disbelief. She froze because she realized in that moment that she had miscalculated not just the law, not just her father's will, but the hearts of the people around her. These were family, friends, neighbors, church folk who had known her since she was in pigtails, who had watched her grow. And now they looked upon her with disappointment, some even with pity. Pride cannot withstand the sting of public shame. Child, it crumbles like dust. I remember watching her shoulders slump ever so slightly, the way a balloon sinks once the air has gone out of it. The fire in her eyes dimmed, and in its place came something else. Fear, maybe, or regret, but it was too late. Once words are spoken, they cannot be gathered back, and hers had already stained the air. The whispers grew, weaving through the pews like a chorus of judgment. Some shook their heads and muttered, "Imagine, at her father's funeral." Others leaned close to one another, whispering words I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I could see it in their faces, the disbelief, the sorrow, the shame, and Clara felt it too. That is why she froze, because she realized in that moment that she had not only embarrassed herself, but dishonored her father's memory in front of all who loved him. I wish I could say I didn't feel a pang of pity for her, but a mother's heart is a complicated thing. Even in betrayal, love lingers. As I sat there watching her pride collapse, part of me wanted to rise, to take her hand, to shield her from the whispers that now seemed to crush her more than any words of mine ever could. But another part of me knew that this was a lesson she had to face. Greed had brought her to that place, and only truth could bring her down. Child, there are moments in life when silence from others can cut sharper than swords. My Clara, who thought she would be applauded, who thought people would rally to her side, instead found herself standing alone. The loneliness in her eyes when she realized that, it was a heavy thing to see. The room, once filled with quiet mourning, was now buzzing with murmurs, yet Clara did not move. She seemed rooted in place, caught between pride and humiliation. She could neither retreat gracefully nor push forward boldly. That is the cruelty of pride. It gives no easy escape once it falters. Her pride collapsed not in a dramatic cry or a loud outburst, but in the stillness of her body and the trembling of her spirit. She froze because she knew she could not undo what she had done, and she froze because the whispers reminded her of it again and again. And me, I stayed seated, my heart aching but my face calm. I did not speak, for there was no need. The truth had already spoken louder than I ever could. I simply watched my daughter, frozen in her shame, and prayed silently that one day she might understand the weight of what she had done, not just to me, but to herself, to her father's memory, to the family name. So yes, my daughter froze, her pride collapsing as whispers filled the room, and in that frozen moment the lesson was plain for all to see. Greed will lift you high in arrogance, but truth will always bring you back down. I held my dignity, knowing silence was my strongest answer. Child, sometimes in life, words only add fuel to a fire, and believe me, I had plenty of words burning inside me that day. When my daughter stood there, frozen, her pride crumbling before everyone's eyes, I could have risen from my seat and scolded her right then and there. I could have reminded her of every lesson I taught her about respect, about patience, about the sacredness of family. I could have shouted, "Clara, this is not the way." But instead, I chose silence. Silence, my dear, can be the heaviest voice in the room. And on that day, in the wake of my husband's passing, silence was my shield, my strength, and my dignity. I sat there with my back straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and I let the whispers swirl around us. My heart was aching. It felt as if two hands were wringing it dry, but I did not let tears or anger escape. I held myself steady because I knew that the moment I lashed out, the moment I let emotion spill, I would only cheapen the truth that had already been spoken on my behalf. My lawyer's words were enough. George's will was enough. There was no need for me to add more. You see, Clara's fall did not need me to push her. She had already tripped over her own greed. All I had to do was remain still and let her see the weight of her actions reflected in the eyes of those around her. My silence said, I do not need to justify myself. The truth speaks louder than anything I could say. In that silence, I thought of George. Oh, how he hated quarrels, especially within the family. He always told me, Margaret, dignity is not in the shouting, it's in the stillness. And so, for his sake, and for mine, I stayed still. My dignity was my way of honoring him that day. I looked around the room at the faces of friends and neighbors. Some looked to me, waiting for an outburst, a declaration, a scene. Others gave me soft nods of approval as though to say, stay strong, Margaret, you don't need to lower yourself. And that was enough encouragement to keep my lips sealed and my head held high. Clara, on the other hand, squirmed under the weight of my silence. She expected me to fight her, to rise up and argue, to give her a stage where she could play the victim. But I refused to give her that stage. Instead, I let the hush linger, a quiet louder than any shouting match. My silence forced her to sit in the consequences of her own words, with no one to blame but herself. Ah, child, dignity is a strange kind of power. It doesn't roar, it doesn't demand attention, but it commands respect. In my silence, I felt strong. I wasn't a weak old widow being pushed aside. No, I was the rightful mistress of my home, the keeper of my husband's memory, and the mother who refused to bow to disrespect. I will not lie inside, I was hurting. It cut me deep that my daughter had chosen greed over grief. But I knew if I let my pain show as anger, it would become her excuse. She would say, "See, my mother is unfair, my mother is cruel." So I held my pain quietly, where no one but God could see it, and I let the world see only my calm. Even now, when I think back to that moment, I thank myself for choosing silence. Because long after the whispers faded, long after the mourners went home, what remained in people's minds was not Clara's greedy declaration, but the image of me sitting strong and steady, untouched by her storm. That is what people remember, and that is what gave me peace. Clara may have lost her pride that day, but I did not lose mine. My silence reminded her and reminded myself that no one can strip you of dignity unless you hand it to them. And I was not about to hand mine over, not even to my own child. So yes, I held my dignity, knowing silence was my strongest answer. And in that silence I found a kind of victory. Not the loud, triumphal kind, but the quiet, lasting kind. The kind that lets you walk back into your home, sit in your favorite chair, and say to yourself, "I did not let bitterness win today." And child, sometimes that's the only victory a mother needs.